Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas I'm going to show you some different ways that you can prime your miniatures. Hey everyone, Matty from the Plastic Canvas, and welcome to the third episode of this series called Anyone, Yes Anyone Can Paint Miniatures. In this series, I'm going to take you through the different steps in the miniature painting process, break them down, show you some basic approaches so that you can see that painting minis is a lot more simple than what you think it may be, and that it's not just for people that can paint to a really high standard. Anyone really can do it. Now, the previous video in this series looked at the different ways that we may need to prep a mini before priming. So if you haven't seen that one yet, there is a link in the description below, so you can go check that one out. But now that we know some of those things that we may need to do, we need to get into priming. So why do we need to prime a miniature? Well, the acrylics that we use to base coat with are designed to stick to other paints, because if you're going to put a second layer of paint on, it needs to stick to that first layer. It's not designed to stick to plastic, which is the main material that our miniatures are made of. So we need to put down a layer of paint first for our acrylics to stick to that can stick to plastic, and that's what our primer is. It's designed to stick to plastic. So let's head down and have a look at a couple of the different options that we have for priming our minis. Alright, so here we have the minis from Detective City of Angels, and what I want to do is use these minis to show you right through the series each step involved in painting a mini, so that you can see consistency from one video to the next, and you can see how these get painted from start to end, rather than using one mini for priming and then a different one for, say, base coating. So you'll see how these get painted from start to end. And I chose these because I think the level of detail and quality in these is fairly indicative of probably what you'll start with when you get into the hobby, and so you should easily be able to take what you see me do with these and use in your own painting. But we're here to talk about priming, so let's have a look at some of the different ways that we can go about that. So like I said in the intro, the reason that we need to prime a mini is because the acrylics that we use to base coat with, like say, these ones here, these are designed to stick to other paint and not the plastic. So before base coating with paints like these, we need to put down a layer of paint that can stick to, that will actually stick to the plastic, and that's what our primer is there for. Now, if you want your decision in terms of what primer you use and how you go about it to be as simple as possible, and you just want to go with what appears to be the most common approach, then just buy yourself a black primer in an aerosol can, and then just spray everything with this. And I think a lot of people go with this option because, first of all, you just have one color. You don't need to buy multiple different primers. But also, this gives you a solid base for all of your base coats to go on top of. So this is just your most basic and what appears to be common approach. If you go with this, in the first video in this series, which was what you need to get started, I go through primers more in depth than what I will here, but just make sure that it does bond to plastic. There are miniature branded primers, and then also one like this that I just bought from my local hardware store. So we'll head outside and we'll have a look at how we can use this to prime our minis. Alright, so you can see that I've mounted the minis on just this larger section of cardboard there, just with some blue tack or poster putty, depending on what it's called in different areas. And so they're just getting stuck down fairly well apart. You can see I've got good gaps in between them there, just to make sure that I can get onto each side of the mini with the spray, rather than just the front and back. And so now with our primer, I'm just going to give it a really, really good shake to make sure it's mixed up. I do this for a good 45 seconds to a minute. I'm not going to show you all of it, so we'll cut to when we come back and it's already mixed together. Alright, so just a couple of things to keep in mind when you're spraying your minis. You want to stick to about 6 to 12 inches away from the mini, just to give the paint particles enough time to spread apart a bit so that you're not hitting the mini with too dense a coat of paint, because it can be very easy to flood the mini and obscure all of your details.
Also, as you're painting, you want to be starting the spray just off the mini and then sweeping across. That way, again, you're not hitting it with that sudden burst that comes out, and that sweeping motion just helps you to keep it nice and smooth and control how much paint goes on. And you can also see that I'm working on each mini individually rather than spraying all of them in one long continuous spray. That's just a way that I go about it myself, just to make sure that I can control how much paint's going on, and I don't hit them with, too much paint all in one go. But that's sort of pretty much all there is to it there, and just making sure that you are getting it from all angles. You can see I've gone back there just to get those last couple of little.
And there we have our four minis primed in black and ready to go. So you could start base coating right now, and this is the what seems to be the most common way that people prime their minis. And like I said, I think this is so that you have a good solid foundational color for all of your base coats to go over the top of. Now, one thing when getting your primer, just to keep in mind that I don't think I mentioned in the first video in the series, the what you need video when talking about the primers, is that you want to get a primer with a matte finish and not a gloss or semi-gloss or anything like that. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Now, as we move into base coating, what we need to be aware of is that when you lay a base coat down, like let's say this red here, just for example, is the color that this ends up drying as after you've put down a couple of coats will be affected by the color that's underneath it. So if I painted this over the black prime, it's going to keep it quite dark. Whereas if you painted this over a lighter primer, say a grey or a white, it's going to help boost the color of this. The other thing is that, especially when painting lighter colors, like say a skin tone or a yellow or something like that, something that's quite bright, is the darker the color that you're painting it over, the more coats it's going to take to actually cover it. So if I was going to, take this tanned skin here and paint the skin tones over the black, it's going to take a few coats. So one other option that you have is to prime in a lighter color, and you might like to prime in grey. So we're going to head out, and I'll prime these in grey, and then I'm just going to come back and show you the difference in how they end up looking. So I'm only going to prime maybe two of them in grey, and I'll show you how they compare back to the black so that you can see the difference that will potentially have on how the base coats will look. Alright, so here we have two of our minis, one done in grey now, the other left is black, and you can already see the difference between the two colours. The grey is quite a bit lighter than the black, it's not a subtle difference, and so you can start to see that if you're going to be painting lots of yellows or fair skin tones, really light colors, it's going to be a lot easier to paint it over the grey than it is with the black. It's going to be quite a few less coats to cover up the grey than what it will be to do the black. So you're going to save yourself a bit of time and make it a bit easier for yourself. So if you're going to be just going with one color, priming everything in the same color, what should it be? Well, it comes down a bit to what colors are going to be on your mini. So there's going to be obviously lots of lighter colors. Grey is definitely the way to go. If you're going to have lots of darker colors though, and you want that color to stay deeper and more solid, for lack of a better term, then black may be your option. For me though, personally, I think probably if you're just sticking with one color for everything, grey is going to be your way to go, because the dark colors still go over it fine because it does still have some depth to it, but those lighter colors are much easier than what it is to paint over black. And when you're starting, you want everything to be as easy as possible, so I think grey is the way to go. But also for me personally, I'm going to be sticking with grey if I'm just going to be priming everything in one color, because I recently just started going through and painting the Mansions of Madness 2nd edition characters just to quickly work through them and get them done. And I primed all of them in grey just because I knew that there was, I was going to be using the same skin tone for all of them, and there's lots of light browns and sort of similar colours to that. So I went with a lighter colour, and it's been really, really easy to paint over, noticeably easier than when going over black. So even for me personally, I'll be sticking with grey instead of going with black. And so I think if you're just going to stick with one colour, grey is a really, really good option, just to make it a lot easier, especially with your lighter tones. So in terms of sticking with one colour, your other option that you have is to buy a coloured primer. So let's say, something like this. I bought this when I was doing Arcadia Quest Inferno for the minions, because most of them are predominantly just their red skin with some armour and things over the top. So I bought this just to spray them all red, and then I went to, if I've got it, so Magma Red here is the final skin color that I went with, and so I laid this down as the prime, and then I just did a single coat with the Magma Red. Because it was already red, it only took one coat, as opposed to priming it in black or grey and then trying to build up to the red over the top of that. So if you've got minis that are going to be pretty well just one color, then buying the coloured primer to match it could be the way to go. What you do need to consider though is, will you ever use it again once you finish painting those minis? And I may never ever use this again. So, I mean, it made it easier, but it probably, in terms long term, it wasn't probably worth buying it. At the time it was good, but that's always another option that you've got. So that's probably it for when looking at priming minis in just one colour. You can also move on to white and just prime in white to make it even lighter, but I think grey is good enough. So the other option that you've got, and you may have heard this, is what's called a Zenithal prime. So when the sun is at its zenith, it's directly above, and so you can prime your minis to look like they're already being lit from directly above. And what that helps with is when you then start to do your when you're doing your highlighting, as you start painting, it gives you an idea of the form of your minis and where your brightest highlights and deepest shadows need to be. But also, if you paint with relatively thin paints over the top, you can have those different tones come through. So where the white is from, where the lighter parts of your primer, after you've base coated, that will be lighter than the darker parts. So the way that we do a Zenithal prime is you hit your mini first with black all over, and then you go grey from a fairly high angle, and then you finish with white from directly above. Now I'm going to show you how to do that with these, but just so that you have an idea of what it may look like, this is one of the Mansions of Madness minis, and you can see there, I've done a Zenithal prime on this guy. So you can see if we look directly underneath, there are spots that are still black, then the mid kind of range of the prime is in grey, and then from directly above is white, and you can already see that all of those shadows are there. So it gives a good idea of where to put all the highlights and shadows when it comes to doing all of the highlights. So we'll head outside, and I'll show you how to do a Zenithal prime. And there's our 4 minis done with a Zenithal Prime. So from here you can see that it gives us a really good indication of where our brightest highlights and our deepest shadows should be. So what I think is a good idea to do at this point is to take photos of your minis from different angles, so that when you do get to that highlighting and shading step, you can refer back to the pictures to make sure that you are putting your different levels of highlights in the correct spot. What you can also do is, when it comes to base coating, you can thin your paints down that a little bit more. So let's sort of say with this red here, thin this down a little bit more than what you normally would, so that then when you paint it over the prime, the different tones are going to come through. So the red will be lighter when it goes over the white than what it will when it goes over the black, and so you'll start to get a little bit of that contrast. So there are a couple of things that you would have noticed that were a little bit different when I was priming. So I didn't have time to talk during the actual footage, so I'll do that now. The first is that I have mounted each of them on the cork. That's because it's really, really important when doing a Zenithal Prime to actually properly get the effect of it looking like it's been hit by light from above, that the grey and the white is in the correct spot. And when you've got these guys stuck to cardboard just next to each other, it's really, really easy to get overspray from one to the next. And if you get that overspray, then the grey and the white is going to end up where it shouldn't be, and you will start to lose that effect. So I've just stuck each of them to their own bit of cork so that I could prime them on their own, no chance of overspray. And then also you saw that I was wearing a glove. That was just a basic latex glove that you can buy in boxes from the supermarket. And that was just so that I didn't get any of the spray on my hand. So the basic process that I went through was to spray them all with black first, just hit them everywhere, and then grey from a fairly high angle. Now sometimes you'll hear people recommend that you spray from a 45-degree angle. I think that's fine if you're working with a bigger mini where the details are more protruding, but on smaller scale minis like this where the details are quite fine, I think you want to be hitting from quite a high angle, just to make sure that you do leave the black on the underside of the details. So if you sort of have a look on the back of the trench coat here, now I know I think this guy here is the one that I used in the actual footage, but this one here I think has some better things to talk about. You can see that we can still see the underside of some of these folds here, but the folds aren't actually sticking out that much because of the scale of the mini. And so if you hit with the grey from too low, like down more like that 45-degree angle, you give yourself a better chance of hitting the underside of some of these details, and you're going to lose that contrast. So that's why I reckon with the smaller mini, hit from a higher angle. And then it was just white from directly above, nothing sort of too much to talk about there. The way I was actually spraying was exactly the same as when doing just the black or just the grey from earlier. So, that 6 to 12 inches away to make sure that you don't douse the mini too much, and then start the spray off the mini and then sweep across to keep it nice and smooth. And then I still like to spray in shorter, quicker bursts than just one sort of longer one. It just gives me better control over how much paint I'm putting down. And yeah, so that's pretty much the technique there for doing a Zenithal Prime. So that's all I want to go through for this video. I think those are probably the most likely ways that you'll be priming as you get started. You can use brush-on primers, but it seems to be pretty uncommon that someone actually needs to do that. It's usually to do with the humidity, so I think your best bet is just to start with an aerosol, and if you find that it's too humid where you live, then move to a brush-on primer, and then it's just brushing it on there. There isn't too much to talk about there. And your other option is also to use an airbrush, but again, not many people are going to be starting with an airbrush, so I don't think it's worth showing in this video. One thing that I think is good to note though, so this guy here that I showed a bit earlier in the video, I did him with my airbrush, and you can see if we sort of compare them, the transition from the black to grey to white is a lot smoother with the airbrush, and also if it's picking up there, we can see the texture from the paint on here, so you can see it looks a bit stipply, whereas it's much, much smoother on this guy, you don't get that effect there as well. So yeah, I think with the airbrush, it's so much better. I never spray from my aerosols anymore. It's all from my airbrush, but obviously it's an additional cost, sorry, and that's up to you whether you can afford to get that. If I was going back from day one, I would get an airbrush and at the very least just to do the priming there. But yeah, that's totally up to whether you can afford it or not. So to sort of summarize all of that, I think if you want the most simple, no fuss approach that's going to make it easiest for you when doing your base coating, just go with grey. Your dark colours will go over it fine, and it makes it easier to paint your lighter colours than if you're using just black. Just black is fine. It is used by lots of people, but I reckon grey is the way to go. And like I said, for myself, moving forward, anytime I am priming with just a single colour, most of the time it's just going to be grey, because those lighter colours just go over it so much easier. And then in terms of whether you're going to do a Zenithal prime or not, I think it kind of comes down a little bit to what you're going to be painting. There are some ways that you can use it in your base coating that I'll show in the next video. But I think if you just start with grey and just get used to that, then you can move on to your Zenithal primes a bit later on. I do a Zenithal prime pretty well all of the time, so I think it is a really good starting point, but not one that you have to do from day one. So I reckon just grab yourself a grey and just spray everything with that, and then move on to your Zenithals from there. So that'll do it for this video. So thank you very, very much for checking out another one of these videos. I hope it has been useful. I hope the information has been clear and has shown that you do have some simple options there to get started. Like I said, the next video in this series will be about base coating. So if this series has been useful so far, and that's another one that's going to be of interest to you and you haven't subscribed yet, please do hit the subscribe button so that you know when these videos are coming out. And if you have been enjoying them, please do hit the like button as well, and stop by the Facebook, Twitter and Instagram accounts for this channel, so that you can see what I'm painting at the moment and what's going to be coming out in videos in the near future. But I think that's it. I don't think there's anything else to say. So this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas signing out. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.